Now, this is not the kind of place that an average tourist would normally go to, and if you ask any German, they'll tell you that Chemnitz does not exactly have a very good reputation, and yet somehow it has been chosen as one of the European capitals of culture for 2025. So how on earth did a place like this get that honour? What is it anyway, and what does the city even have to offer? Now, Chemnitz's reputation is probably the one thing most holding it back. This became most obvious when I posted to my community tab the view from my hotel window, thinking nobody would be able to guess where this was, but apparently the graffiti was a dead giveaway. One person even managed to identify the exact hotel, another suggested I visit some other city, and one thought that being an immigrant, I had to be suicidal to go to Chemnitz. I think the problem of the city's reputation has two main causes, and that last comment is an example of the first. It's assumed, being in Saxony, that Chemnitz is full of racists and fascists. It didn't help when, in 2018, clashes between left-wing and right-wing activists were described by the media as mob violence, with foreigners being hunted down and beaten, claims that were, it seems, grossly exaggerated. I did see a few people I thought it best to steer clear of, but I never actually felt unsafe, and it wasn't much more than I'd experienced before in some other cities. The second image problem the city has is its past in the German Democratic Republic, when it was renamed Karl-Marx-Stadt in honour of a man who had no actual connection to the city at all. Its most well-known landmark was, and still is, a massive sculpture of Marx's head, the world's second biggest bust, beaten only by Lenin's head in the Siberian city of Ulan-Ude. And so, this is what people usually imagine when they think of this city. It's hardly surprising because this is how it used to market itself, a modern socialist paradise. And yes, these are genuine postcards. To this day, you'll see apartment blocks like this. This area is called the Rose Court, as in 1965, 5,000 roses taken from World War II battlefields and concentration camps were planted here. But this isn't, as you might be thinking, a residential district in the outskirts. This is in Chemnitz's historic centre. The Rose Court was built on what was the horse market. Wait. Chemnitz has a historic centre? Well, yes, the remains of one. You can actually trace the outline of the medieval city on a street map, but if you're looking for pre-war buildings, these are the only ones that survive. Although, even that's a bit of a technicality. For example, an inscription on this building states that it had to be rebuilt in 1953. But right at the core of the city is a little ensemble that gives you an idea of what it might now look like if we hadn't had the Second World War and the internal combustion engine. The old city hall doesn't look exactly as it did in the 17th century. Since its reconstruction after the war, it now has one extra story, and this portal, depicting the suicide of Lucretia for some reason, is in the wrong place. It also boasts the most disappointing glockenspiel I have ever seen. It starts off promising enough, although if you want to hear anything, don't stand next to the fountain. Now, this part is clearly a marvel of engineering, but then the fun really doesn't start as, one by one, each figure slowly steps out, stands there for a bit, nervously turns one way and then the other, and finally shuffles back in. The whole show takes something like 15 minutes and is a lot less exciting than, for example, the one in Munich. According to my research, it was built in the 1990s, but I haven't been able to find out how it compares with any previous version there may possibly have been. Although the old City Hall had to be rebuilt, the early 20th century new City Hall survived the war almost undamaged. It features the traditional Roland statue, common in medieval cities in northern and eastern parts of Germany, and of course, the city coat of arms. And if you've been to Saxony before, you may feel that this coat of arms looks familiar. It looks confusingly similar to the coats of arms of Leipzig and Dresden, as all three of them reference the same two aristocratic families. St. James's Church is also part of the same ensemble. It was very badly damaged in the war, but not completely destroyed. I think it's a little ironic that Karl-Marx-Stadt chose to preserve what to me seems like a symbol of the union of secular and religious authority, but maybe I'm reading too much into that. The only truly medieval building here is the Red Tower, part of the city defences, and, you've guessed it, rebuilt after the war. You have to bear in mind that Chemnitz was very heavily bombed. 80% of the city centre was destroyed, and in total, over a third of its residential apartments were lost. So it was perhaps understandable that it was felt easier to just design and build a completely new city from scratch. And this happened in West Germany as well, looking at you, Stuttgart. Unfortunately, it happened at a time when architects were discovering new and exciting ways to build with concrete and glass, and East Germany was short on cash and long on ideology. An ideology that is particularly evident in the motivational texts the government was fond of, some of which are downright sinister. But what was needed was, more than anything else, places for people to live. And so outside of the centre, huge residential areas were built as quickly and cheaply as possible, often in the form of monolithic blocks like these. They did the job, but when reunification came, they were suddenly seen as unattractive and substandard.
Now, these buildings were not terrible places to live, just not particularly good ones either. They were actually not badly designed, nice city-style mid-rise buildings with very well-designed apartments that made excellent use of the space available to them. But like many cities in this part of Germany, Chemnitz was left with a decision what to actually do with them. Well, some of these places were torn down and replaced with smaller houses, Western style, whereas other ones like these were simply modernised and given a bit of extra much-needed infrastructure.
Infrastructure that included shopping facilities that were rather lacking. A couple of old department stores had survived the war and were still in use. This one, built in 1930, is now the Archaeological Museum, while this has been converted into a sort of multi-purpose cultural centre. But it wasn't enough, and so huge modern malls sprang up in the outskirts and smaller shopping arcades in the centre. But developers went a little overboard, and now Chemnitz has too many retail outlets and is still building more. As one local told me, they just don't have that much money to spend. The old centre has once more been completely redesigned, with ultra-modern post-reunification styles clashing with the few remaining historic buildings. Actually, I didn't mind this as much as I usually do. So little of the original architecture remains that the modern buildings don't feel like intrusions, and for the most part they are the right kind of scale. This shopping centre is clearly very modern, while at least making an attempt to fit in. It's a bit kitschy, but it feels like what would happen if Soviet architects did pastiche. Of course, this does leave Karl Marx looking directly at a capitalist paradise, which I feel is a bit harsh, but not all of the choices made in the 90s were good ones, and just a short distance away from the centre is one of the worst.
This is Brühl, which was quite an important and popular shopping street before reunification, but since then it's all gone downhill. What happened?
What happened was that the city shot itself in the foot. The plan was that as residents and businesses moved out, the properties would not be rented out again. Rich investors from the West would then eagerly buy these properties, modernize them, rent them out, and start generating tax revenue. Unfortunately, investors had no interest at all and the whole scheme collapsed. More recently, the city has taken a few small steps to make the place look nicer, but with limited success.
So I wondered if there was any more life in this place in the evenings, and yeah, not really.
Quite remarkable considering that this quarter is right next to the Polytechnic, so should really be filled with student-friendly bars. By contrast, the centre may not be lively, but it is at least buzzing. Incidentally, what made Chemnitz great was industry. It still is an industrial city, but obviously while a few of the old factories are still in use, most have been demolished, repurposed, or sadly left to decay and replaced by more modern facilities. And by now, you're probably wondering when I'm going to get to the point, but don't worry, here it comes. What I've tried to describe is a city that has potential but faces a lot of challenges, especially with regard to its image, and this actually makes it an excellent choice for European Capital of Culture. Every year, 2 or 3 cities are chosen for the honour, partly to celebrate the diversity of European cultures, but mostly to give the chosen cities a much-needed boost, especially in the area of investment in the arts. The ideal capital of culture is one you would never have considered for its culture and just needs a helping hand. When you think of European culture, you might be thinking of something like this: endless operas and countless oil paintings. But Chemnitz also has a range of other options. More contemporary entertainment can be found in the Civic Hall, as well as museums, art galleries, and other venues dotted about the city. This former warehouse is being converted into the headquarters of the company coordinating various cultural projects being financed as part of the Capital of Culture, projects which hopefully will have a lasting and positive impact on the city. But let me wrap this up with 2 examples of why I think Chemnitz deserves a chance. First, this sculpture honours the fact that the official borders of the city bear a passing resemblance to the outline of Antarctica, and it sits on a line of longitude that passes through Antarctica, and I feel cruel in pointing out that this is what all lines of longitude do. And second, there used to be a castle here. Only a small part of it still stands, but it left a very pleasant park with everything you need to just wind down and escape the noise and stress.
As I was doing my research, it became clear to me quite quickly that Chemnitz was probably not as bad as its reputation, although that's the case with most big cities. But I was surprised at just how much I actually liked the place. I mean, I'm not going to lie, it's not my favourite city, but if you told me that I had to live here for the rest of my life, well, I wouldn't be too upset about it. The locals that I interacted with were very friendly, and it was a lot more cosmopolitan than I thought it would be. And I think that if it plays its cards right, Chemnitz could actually have a pretty good future.
Chemnitz is famous for not having great rail connections, with only 2 intercity trains a day. For regional trains, it is a stop on the Dresden to Hof line, and there is also an hourly connection from Leipzig, although that one currently uses very old trains that are not great for anyone with mobility issues.